listening to Jose Antonio Vargas a few minutes ago, I was struck that he was giving us a window, even though he is now this kind of big public figure, into the inner life of a very young person who was undocumented in this country as a 12-year-old and as a young teenager and then as a young adult, and the complicated family dynamics that were raised there. We are now going to move back into the scholarly realm and ask what we really do know about immigrant children and families. We're lucky to have Joanna Dreby with us all the way from Albany, from SUNY Albany. She is an expert on undocumented immigrant children, and she's going to talk to us about that, about perception, social perception and self-perception, about stigma, mental health impact, and all kinds of other intertwined issues that lie behind the kind of story that Jose Antonio just told us. So, turn it over to you, and we'll see where we go with it.
Thank you.
You can use the keyboard, you can use the mouse.
That's great. Well, thank you, and I'm so glad to be here. I feel like I always have to start a talk like this with a little bit of personal disclosure. I always wanted to be a journalist, so I think it's only been in the past few years that I've come to terms with the fact that I'm really not, and I do other things, and I'm okay with that. So, but I'm really excited to be with this group. Because I also consider myself to be a storyteller, although perhaps I tell my stories in a little bit of a different fashion. So how does it come up there? Oh, okay. Well, I'll wait for a minute to start the story. I'll start with the story. Okay, there we go. You might not be able to see it anyway. So I asked this 10-year-old girl named Andrea if she knows what an immigrant is. She told me, yeah. It's when someone is illegal in this country and the police, ICE, come to look for them and send them back to their country. Her eyes then started to water when she told me that her parents are immigrants. I asked if she's proud that her parents are immigrants, and she said no. Do you ever feel scared that they're immigrants? I continued. Yeah, she said, with her chin quivering. What scares you? I asked her. When the police, ICE come, that they will take them. So Andrea was really remarkable to me because she's actually this super shy 10-year-old girl. Her mom told me, you might not even be able to interview her because she's so shy. She kind of like walks around talking with her hand in front of her mouth. You know those little preteen girls that are kind of embarrassed by their own movements. I mean, she's a really shy young girl, and I was shocked that she was able to express this type of emotion in kind of this rather sterile interview setting. I had actually known Andrea for quite a long time. I knew her the first week of her life. But when I interviewed her, she told me she didn't remember me at all. I had known her mother back when her mother was still married to Andrea's father, and I was a young mother as well, and we both had young kids together. I actually found a picture only a few weeks ago of me with a toilet paper measuring Leticia, Andrea's mother's belly while at the baby shower. So I've known the family for a while, but Andrea didn't know me. And I had been working on a project where I was interviewing, or just finished a project where I've interviewed kids in Ohio and New Jersey about what it's like growing up in Mexican immigrant households. And I sort of thought I would focus in the project on the differences between Ohio and New Jersey, which I will touch upon today. But Andrea, one of the last people I interviewed, kept talking again about these fears. And she really convinced me, as other children did, that I needed to focus my writing on the impacts of illegality on children, because that was the story they wanted to tell, and that was the story that they needed to tell. Now, of course, there's a pretty strong reason, I'm going to skip that slide, to focus on the experiences of illegality. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these numbers, but basically we're in a time period when there are more deportations than at any other point historically, 400,000 every year since 2009. And this is actually a pretty drastic increase from just 10 years ago. The Mexican community in particular, the families that I was interviewing, felt the impact of enforcement policies fairly strongly. So Mexicans are 30% of the foreign-born, 58% of the unauthorized. They're definitely overrepresented, but they're more overrepresented among those detained, among those forcibly removed, and among voluntary departures. So they're really feeling the crunch of these enforcement efforts more strongly, I think, than other communities. And I just can't help my academic self by putting up a few graphs just to see visually. I mean, this is a huge, drastic increase in the numbers of people who've been deported. And I think we know this story, but it's an important one to remember when we think about children's stories and experiences. So I'm a sociologist, and I'm a sociologist who does in-depth qualitative work. So what I'm really interested in is how children go about their daily lives and what the meanings of things like immigration policy are in children's everyday lives as they go about. How important is it? Are they walking around in fear all the time? I mean, that's really not the case, and I don't want to give that impression today at all. I think the fear is a very underlying type of experience that crops up now and then, and children are children, and they go about their lives and have other things that are important to them as well. But I kept hearing from children again and again how these policies do have sort of trickle-down effects that are important. And as a sociologist, I'm also really interested in looking at how these experiences differ across two localities, like as I said, in Ohio and in New Jersey, because local enforcement efforts are actually very different in different places, which I think all of you probably also know. So I just want to tell you what I did very quickly. I'm going to run through this, but the project is based on 91 interviews with parents, 110 interviews with children, which I've done myself in Ohio and New Jersey, 80 families in total. I purposefully included families in which there were US-born parents, legal migrant parents, and undocumented children, and also, or parents, and also those same three categories of children. So I'm trying to capture across different types of legal statuses within families. And I also did home and school visits with children in the second and third grades in a smaller group of families, 6 families in Ohio and 6 in New Jersey. The research it's a 4-year project that really coincides with this increase in enforcement. So what I want to do today is tell you about these two localities, because I think there are some very important differences. And then I want to focus on what are the experiences that children have with illegality that are similar across the two sites. So in other words, in what ways are national policies impacting children no matter where they live, and in what ways might they be different at the local level? So the first place where I started my interviews was in Northeast Ohio. Northeast Ohio is a pretty economically depressed region, as we may know, some of us. Me having lived there for a little while. But there is a Mexican community there, and it took me a little while to find this community because they don't concentrate in one neighborhood where I was working. There isn't like a little part of the city where all the Mexicans live. People actually live fairly dispersed throughout the communities in different places. It's a dispersed community. It's also a fairly invisible community. There are other refugee groups in this area, so they take on the public face of immigration. If you ask the school teachers, which I did in my work, you know, what are the problems of immigrants, they speak immediately of the refugee children, not of Mexican children that I interviewed. This means that the kids I interviewed tended to be the only Mexicans in their class or their grade or sometimes their school, so they're not around a lot of other kids like themselves. The families I met worked low-wage jobs, but it's really important to remember that the cost of living is fairly low. So they're living in a place where they can afford, on these low-wage jobs, to rent their own apartments, and most families did. A lot of the women I interviewed actually didn't work because they didn't want to pay for childcare, and they were able to afford to do that. New Jersey is a little bit of a different scenario across the river. I worked in central New Jersey. It's a more bustling site. In this community, the Mexican population grew in the 1990s, just as it had in Ohio, but it did so in a very concentrated manner. So in New Jersey, there's a little part of the city that people refer to as Little Mexico, which used to be Little Hungary, actually, in the 1960s, but it's an area of a very strong concentration of the Mexican immigrant community. In fact, at one of the schools that I visited, the principal estimated that 80% of the children at that school were children of Mexican parents, second generation. It's a very high concentration. The families I interviewed also worked as low-wage workers, but because the cost of living was very high, a lot of the families were doubled up, renting a room in an apartment and with the entire family in a room. So I think these things are pretty important, and they're very different. Just to visualize, just so you can see, maybe you can't see on this map. Again, it's the sociologist in me, I like maps. But all of the places that aren't gray are the places where I interviewed families, the census tracts. And this is Ohio, and the percent of the families that I interviewed lived in census tracts with very low percentages that were foreign-born. In New Jersey, I interviewed a few people living in outlying communities, but the concentration up there, there's even one or two census districts or census tracts, that are in the red, which is a high concentration of foreign-born, and there's a similar pattern when looking at the percent Latino or Hispanic. So we're talking about very different communities. Now, in New Jersey, what does this mean on the ground for families? Well, it means that in New Jersey, the families I interviewed were living in a place that actually had quite a bit of infrastructure to support them. Previously, the chief of police in the city was a Puerto Rican. There were a lot of local bilingual advocates and police officers. There had been some tensions over gang violence in the community. However, there also was a lot of cooperation with police for families in terms of domestic violence. They have a special outreach team. So a lot of the families I interviewed had positive interactions with the police. And in fact, most of the stories of deportations that I came across occurred after kind of severe problems with the law. So it wasn't just that somebody had been a passenger in the vehicle, but one of the fathers had been speeding and didn't have a license and had young children in the car. And then, so the bar for having problems was a little bit higher than in Ohio. In Ohio, where I did the work, there was actually, in a city that boasted about 150,000 residents, a bit larger than in New Jersey, there was not one single bilingual police officer. There were no social service advocates. In fact, what happened, I still think this is amazing as I tell this story, and I still wonder if I'm going to get in trouble at some point for saying this, but what happened at the time when I was doing research is if somebody got pulled over by the police, they would get sent to the local prison, and then the police officer would call ICE on a detainer. And sometimes it took 2, 3, 4 days for ICE to come down and pick up that person. During that time, that person didn't appear on anybody's jail rosters, so they effectively disappeared. The only way somebody could find that person was this woman who was a volunteer at the church who knew the police officers would go over. People would call her and be like, I think somebody got picked up, and she would go over and she knew which police officers were nice and would tell her. So it's a very, very different type of environment. So definitely the types of deportation stories I heard were from very minor traffic incidents. One family, for example, both the mother and father were detained when I believe he had stopped at a stop sign in a Walmart and then turned right, which I'm not sure why that's illegal, but anyway, I've thought about this a lot. How could that be construed illegal? But that's what happened. He was deported to Mexico, and his wife was released with an ankle bracelet around her leg. So of those people I interviewed, and this is of course not representative because I interviewed people who I found, but in Ohio, there were more families that had experiences where someone had been arrested, detained, or deported compared to New Jersey, but we can see that it was sort of a common experience, at least being arrested. Okay, so this is the environment that the children I met are living in. How do children experience illegality in these two sites? What is the same? What does it not matter, these local differences? First, the fears of the police. You know, you would think that the kids in Ohio were more afraid, but I found children in New Jersey and in Ohio to express the same types of fears. The undocumented children I met talked about these fears. Their parents told me, this is a mother speaking about her two children, that they know about their legal status. And sometimes when I see a patrol car, I say, police in sight, and they know they have to sit straight. They know that the danger's gone, they can relax. Another mother told me about how her daughter would bite her nails out of worry about her undocumented status. She was afraid that somebody would ask her. So these fears were pretty strong, and I actually think they're very important because we often hear stories, particularly of the dreamers not knowing they were out of status until they came of age. But I actually found that under this environment where we have so many deportations going on, children at very young ages are quite aware of legal status and its complications. The other thing that children told me, regardless of their own legal status, was about their fears of family separation. So a US citizen girl told me that she's scared because her mom is an immigrant, because she said, if I'm here and my mom goes to Mexico, I'm going to be sad because I would miss her. A 10-year-old boy said, what happens if some cop comes into our house and he wants to see our papers, and then when we don't have it, my little brother and my other cousin have theirs, and we'd have to go, and that's what's scary about it. He's an undocumented child. So this awareness that family separation is a real possibility was similar for children in different places. The media. I have to talk about the media to this group because I wondered often, since there were actually very few children, I tried to interview families in which there were deportations, but it was actually pretty hard for me even to identify families. So, I asked children, well, after they told me they were afraid, well, do you know anybody this has happened to? And a lot of them told me they hadn't. So how do you know about it? Well, that's where the media comes in. You know, a lot of the families watch Spanish language media, and so they hear stories about people being picked up and taken away. A 10-year-old told me that she saw it on TV, and a 12-year-old told me that she's scared that members of her family are immigrants, because when that happened on the news, a lot of people were getting catched, and they came to the door random, and they just took them. Yeah, I got really scared that time. So there's something about children are seeing these messages about what's happening nationally, that even if they're living in a community like in New Jersey where people aren't randomly stopped in their homes, children are still absorbing these messages and hearing about them. Another common theme I heard from children, regardless of where they lived and regardless of their own legal status, is that they talked about immigration as being associated with illegality, like Andrea, who I opened the my talk with today. A 12-year-old who is a US citizen, I asked him, as I asked all the children, do you know what an immigrant is? What would it be like to be an immigrant? He said, they must be scared because if they catch them, then they'd have to go back to their country. And a 10-year-old told me that it would be weird to be an immigrant. I think that the people that are not from here, they're not supposed to be here. I mean, maybe these sound sort of pedantic and not really that surprising, but I actually think it's kind of surprising because we're kind of a country of immigrants, and all these children, if you go to their schools, they're learning about immigration. In third grade, they have big units about immigration, Ellis Island. So children are starting to think that there's something about immigration that is wrong, that is bad, that is illegal. And in fact, children associated with a stigma with immigration and didn't want to let anybody else know that someone in their family was an immigrant. An 8-year-old citizen girl told me, they're like me because I was born in a different place from my mom, so she doesn't tell anybody or doesn't talk about this. Another girl told me that she would only tell her friends that keep secrets well, that her mom was born in Mexico. And a 10-year-old told me he didn't want people to know because then it spreads around the whole school and they start rumors. In fact, only 27 children told me that they felt proud of their immigrant heritage compared to 81% that said they were proud of their Mexican heritage. I think this is very important because for children, there's something about being an immigrant that's now turning into this nasty, dirty word. I wonder why, when all we see on TV in those videos, the images they're hearing is illegal, right? That's a bad word for a young child. And I think this has some very severe consequences. Of course, there are some differences across the two sites in what I've seen with how children experience illegality. Now, in Ohio, it was really interesting to me because in Ohio, the children went to these schools where they were like one of the only Mexican kids, right? So you would think maybe they would feel more targeted or more different. But comments in our interviews suggested that for children in Ohio, they understood the threat of deportation, but only as it impacted their families. It was sort of intangible. It was like something that could happen to them, but it wasn't something that they went about in their everyday life talking about. In fact, for children in Ohio, what was much more important was being Mexican. Race was more important for children in Ohio. They talked about being teased because they were Mexican. They talked about feeling excluded because they were Mexican. So just because I want to make sure we have time for conversation, I'm going to skip through these quotes a little bit, but I have a bunch of quotes from children talking about the racialized incidents they experience. And one case that I'm not putting up here, but there was even a case where a girl was pushed down the stairs. She was bullied so much at school, she broke her arm. They were a legal migrant family. The mom returned to Mexico because the school teachers wouldn't do anything about it. She was so upset. So they went back to Mexico and then came back when she was done her schooling. So the children in Ohio, of course, in this final quote here, this is a mom reporting about her son experienced teasing. She says, the parents tell them something like, oh, well, that's because they're all illegals and this and the other thing. And that is why he is always saying that he is not Mexican. So it's not that like being illegal doesn't matter, it's just like it's kind of like comes together with this package. It's like packaged with Mexican in this funny way in Ohio. But in New Jersey, it was really different. So if in New Jersey, 25% of kids, 1 in 4, said they felt excluded, fewer kids did in New Jersey. They were going to school with everybody that looked like them. Check out this picture. You can't see because it's dark, but basically this is at the school, one of the schools where I was doing observations. All the kids they look like, they all look like each other. They're all Mexican. So for children, you would think that maybe in New Jersey it matters a little less, right? Maybe everybody's in the same boat. Everybody has parents who are immigrants. Immigration doesn't matter as much. Well, I found it's really kind of different. Now, hopefully you can see these numbers up here. But I asked all those 110 kids I interviewed, if their friends know what country they came from, or their parents came from, if they want their friends to know what country they came from. And then I asked them, do your friends know that you speak Spanish or your parents speak Spanish, and do you want them to know? And then I asked the same thing about immigration, it depends whether or not they tell me they're an immigrant or their parents, but I say, do your friends know that someone in your family is an immigrant? Do you want them to know? So if you look at these numbers, kids in Ohio actually were much more likely to tell their friends or to be okay with other people knowing. Perhaps they already stand out, it sort of doesn't matter. But in New Jersey, look at the bottom numbers, only 16% of the kids I interviewed said that their friends know that someone in their family is an immigrant and that they want their friends to know that they're immigrants. This is a community of everybody's an immigrant. All of the kids I interviewed, they're going to school. Everybody around them are immigrants. It's amazing, but they don't want anybody to know. What is that about? To me, it's bizarre. So here's what I think it's about. I think that for kids growing up in New Jersey, illegality is not really just a family matter. It's something that affects them in their daily lives outside the home. They're actually really acutely aware of illegality, and so they carefully monitor how they talk about their family to their friends. Not only could this information potentially threaten their families, but children felt like it could be a point for exclusion or stigma among their peers. So I just want to tell the story. I put the quote up, but I'm going to tell the story and end with a story because I think it demonstrates pretty clearly what I'm talking about, but I have to give you the background because otherwise it won't make sense. So I'm in the basement cafeteria in the school in New Jersey that smells a lot like grease and ketchup, you know, and wax, because it's like wax, something on. And you can imagine me, you know, I'm tall, with glasses, I look like a professor, but I'm sitting there scrunched up at the bench with the kids because I sit there having lunch with them. And none of the other adults do. So I'm sitting there having lunch with all the kids. And, you know, they're sharing ketchup fries with me, and it's pretty gross. But we're all there, we're hanging out, and I'm feeling a little out of place. But I'm looking up and down, and the girls that are right next to me, there was actually, in this school, there was a newcomer classroom for kids that have just arrived that aren't at grade level. So they have bilingual classes, newcomer classes, and regular classes. And there were two girls next to me that were Dominican, and they were in the newcomer class because they had just arrived from the Dominican Republic. And they start chatting away about how the school lunches in this basement cafeteria are so much better than what they used to get back at home. And they're like comparing it back and forth. So I was like, oh, so, you know, how many other kids like you here at this table went to school in the DR? And they look up and down the room, and they're like, boom, 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 boom. They named 6 kids right off the top of the bat. They all had been in the DR, and they all knew it. So I'm looking around, and I say, how many of the kids have been to school in Mexico here? And they look at, the girl I asked looks at me blankly. She has no idea. She shrugs her shoulders. There's another little girl across the table who's like the most talkative girl. She was crazy. She went like this to her ESL teacher one time I was watching her. I mean, she was outrageous. She like bopped him on the butt. You know, she's like super talkative, kind of this outrageous girl. She's like, no, you know, I was born in St. Peter's. And she's talking to me in perfect Spanish. I was born in St. Peter's, I don't know. So nobody could tell me who was born in Mexico. Finally, this girl who's listening to the conversation the whole time, who's really light-skinned, and I actually thought she might be Puerto Rican, she's like, actually, I was born in Puebla, and I went to school there. And I said, well, anybody else? She's like, I don't know. So later on, I went to the school social worker, and I found out that in that class, you know, 6 had been born in the DR, and 6 had been born in Mexico. Same amount. There's something about, for the Mexican kids, that is stigmatized, that's viewed as a negative thing to disclose that your family is an immigrant family because it may be associated with illegality in a way that doesn't work the same way for the kids from the DR who all came on visas. So I think these are some of the interesting differences, and I'm going to end there because I know we want to have some conversation and back and forth. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, come on up.
Audibility and everything else. So, as I was watching this data, it occurred to me that maybe this may be an obvious question, but I need to ask it. What do we know about the sort of lifetime consequences for children of living with chronic fear? You're describing children living with in an atmosphere of chronic fear about their family's safety and security, and fear about the truth of their own stories. What do we know about this?
You know, I think if you were to speak with a psychologist, you would get a really different perspective. I'm a sociologist, and I'm always in that uncomfortable position that I can't really advise, you know, on mental health. But here's my perspective for what it's worth. We don't know. Because quite honestly, this increase in enforcement tactics is new. I worked in this community in New Jersey since 1999, the community I was in, and in 2001, I worked in social services. I don't remember it being the same way, and maybe I was totally ignorant and naive, and maybe border communities have had different experiences, but this nationwide effort and focus on enforcement is new. So long-term impacts, I think we'll find out if we don't have immigration reform. I think that's the big question. You know, people are afraid, but long-term impacts, I think we will see what happens.
And did any of your work extend out of the classroom to their families? Did
Yeah.
you do parent interviews and so on?
Yeah, I interviewed all the kids' parents, and I spent time in their homes and hung out with their
And
parents.
what
yeah.
did you find parallel levels of fear and so on, or what did you
Yeah,
find?
I mean, I think it's interesting. I focus work on young children, which I think in order to get anything from young children, you have to understand the whole picture, and you have to talk to their parents. And one thing I learned is that parents actually don't really want to talk about immigration to their kids, so they avoid talking about it. And a number of parents told me, "Oh, my child doesn't know. We don't, I don't want to worry them. They're little, And then I interview their kids, and their kids know exactly what's going on.
And the kids are
Yep.
worrying whether
Yeah.
the parents know.
Yep. And they don't want to talk about it. They don't have anyone to talk about it to. In fact, this one very outspoken boy I met in New Jersey, he's telling me this, and I was like, "Oh, well, do you talk to your parents about this?" "Not really." And I said, "Well, that sounds really tough. What do you do about this?" He said, "Oh, well, me and my cousin have a plan. We've got backpacks in the closet. We're going to run away if ICE comes." So he made a plan, but he had not done this in consultation with his parents. Yeah.
Thoughts, queries from the room here? Yeah. So can I get you the mic?
I have a question. Okay, so just to clarify, because we had been talking about dreamers before,
Yeah.
right? And how some of them find out later on in life
Yeah.
that they're undocumented.
Yeah.
So are you saying that you're finding that the parents are telling, that the child is undocumented, that the parents are telling the children so they're aware of it? And is there data on that? I'm just wondering.
Well, I think
because of the deportations.
Yeah, I mean,
aspect.
it's actually something I've thought a lot about because I've read a lot of the work on the Dreamers, and I've been very interested in that. And I really have come to the perspective, just on the work that I've done, that we're in a different era, and that children know about it because their parents need them to know that they need to sit straight if the police, if they're in the car, their kids need to know. But I guess what I'm trying to say is their parents don't sit down and make a plan about it because they don't want to worry their children about something they themselves don't understand or have any idea what will happen. They don't necessarily have a plan. The parents I interviewed, for going back home, there were a few families that had set up plans, but a lot of the families, they weren't sure what would happen. They were worried about it as well, and they didn't want to communicate that worry to their children. So they sort of avoid the topic. I'm a parent, and I do that sometimes. Things I don't feel like I can really fully explain. So I think that's what's going on. Children know, and they're aware, but they don't tend to talk about it.
So, do you know, is there data on specifically on that, whether parents are telling their children at a younger age now?
I mean, I think this, like I said, I've been to a number of conferences. Yeah. I think this is the only work, and we don't have generalizable data about undocumented populations. We don't have statistical data on this.
Is there an easily accessible database of immigration-related research?
I think that there are new data sets that are now including legal status, but I think in general, in sociology and in other research, they did not include legal status variables for many years. So it's, all the information we have from demographers are estimates, so we don't have a lot of good data.
Other questions, queries? Yeah. Asking questions. This is why we're here.
Do you know, is there any, are there any academic papers sort of drawing the parallels between the undocumented immigrant children who may have experienced, for example, being part of a raid in the middle of the night? Do their fears correlate to, say, the children of refugees or asylees who may have experienced, more oppressive situations, war situations? I mean, is there some?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I hate to be like, this is new, but in a way it really is. Us academics, we work really slowly, Like, you guys see my data and you're probably like, oh yeah, 2009. And then when I'm getting it reviewed, people are like, oh, you have such fresh new data, So it's like this crazy thing. But there is a growing body of literature And there are some people, psychologists, who've done work on the trauma of deportation, and I'd be glad to share some of those papers with you. But I think this is something that it's cutting edge. It's what we're trying to explain and understand, because it's new.
2 places you could also go for work on that. There's something called the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which is a national network of clinicians and researchers working on children's issues in general, and they focus on all of these subsets. And there's something called the National Center for PTSD, which is part of the Veterans Administration. And if you go to their website, there is a database called PILOTS, P-I-L-O-T-S, which is a global database of trauma-related research of all kinds. And if you were to put children, immigration, deportation in there, you would get a good hit of scholarly literature who's doing this kind of stuff. Other queries? Yes, Skip.
Does anybody, or has anybody studied what deportees, especially if they're kids or young people, after they're deported? I mean, years ago, this is old data, but a friend of mine who hung around in Southeast Asia for many, many, many years, and the last time I was in contact with him, he had a program for Cambodian kids. There were, in the Cambodian community, mostly in California, there was a huge amount of gang affiliation. And these were kids who, they'd been in California since they were 2 years old. They didn't speak Khmer, they didn't know anything, they'd never been in Cambodia, but when they were locked up for gang activity, they shoved them back to Phnom Penh, which is like sending them to some other planet.
Yeah.
And Bill had a sort of a residential facility where he took care of these kids. As I say, this is about 8-10 years ago that I've lost track of him since. I haven't been in touch. But that's sort of stuck in my mind. And I was wondering, you're studying the effects on kids here, but what about kids who go through deportation?
Well, it's a great question. Of the families that I interviewed, the typical scenario is that the father's deported and the family tries to stay here. And so there is quite a bit of research. And so the question is, what happens to deportees? Well, there's quite a bit of research that indicates that most of them are men and they cannot get meaningful employment in their countries of origin. And they're facing very difficult situations there. I did some research this summer in Mexico. I interviewed people who'd returned, and one of the men I interviewed was a deportee. He had been in jail for gang involvement, similar to your story. He couldn't find a job in Mexico. His ex-wife, or his wife, who was a US citizen, divorced him after he was incarcerated, remarried, and he hasn't spoken to his children since, he would love to. He told me he tried to come back across the border because he wanted to be near his children, and he actually got picked up again. And then, he's just like, if I go again, I'll get picked up, I'll be in jail. So he's basically, his relationship with his children has been severed as a result of deportation. And I think that's a very important story, is that men's relationships with their children are really ending. Yeah.
And that's a story that could be done on a local.
I'm sorry?
Would this happen to a lot of teenagers?
If teenagers are here and sent back, if they can't find employment. There is some work in Mexico about children readjusting to life there and being stigmatized, and I'm involved with looking for a grant now to look at that. So I'm somewhat familiar with the data. Again, we don't have great information about what's happening. I can just tell you from my interviews this summer, that children are, depending on their age, integrating differently.
Yeah.
Oh, I just wanted to say, this summer the Chicago Reporter did a really interesting investigation that found that ICE was regularly deporting people to actually the most violent parts of Mexico. So that might be something you want to look at.
Actually, I was going to ask you if there's any correlation that you found or that anyone's looking at between the kinds of fear and issues facing kids here and the levels of violence in their home communities, their original communities of origin.
Yeah, I don't know work on it. I think that's a very important topic, and it's a lot of the families I interview are coming from places that are experiencing extreme violence. I've mostly worked with families in Oaxaca, which is not really involved in the drug business so much, but there are some very rural communities that have a lot of localized violence and similar experiences. So unfortunately, you can't go back. Yeah.
One more, if we have time, and then we'll call it a day. Yeah.
I'm wondering if the schools that you went to, if they kind of ever in their curriculum like teach children about like immigration to America, if they ever make kids do like, you know, like family heritage projects. Like I had to start doing that almost every other year since 4th grade.
Yeah.
But that's kind of how like but that has resulted in that like when I hear the word immigrant, I immediately think of like Ellis Island. I think of like tenement buildings. I think of like mostly European immigrants, but mostly I think of people like struggling because that's how they framed lessons on immigration in my school. They talk about it as people struggling in poverty.
Yeah.
But the kids that you talk to, it seemed like when they think of immigrant, they think of what they hear on news reports of people being deported. So I'm wondering if those schools that you went to, if they ever make lessons on immigration part of the curriculum to give kids a different association with the word.
Yeah, I mean, I think all schools, both in Ohio, New Jersey, I have children in New York State school systems, they have a standardized curriculum in the public schools that does Ellis Island, which is probably why you've done that. And in New Jersey, they take a trip to Ellis Island. I really think that, you know, if I had any recommendation for teachers or school teachers to make it alive to the experiences of children today is really important, because it's one thing to read these historical stories, and it's another to have your own experience. You know, in preparation for this project, I did like a literature search of children's stories about immigration, and there's this like great book, I thought, it was called like Detained, Deported, whatever, Removed, and I was like, oh great, it's a fabulous kid story. This is something that kids can look at. So I got it, and it was about, you know, 1920. Yeah. And I think there's a real disconnect between children's experiential, you know, they have a lot of experience with immigration, but there's a disconnect.
And I have to say, that strikes me as an ideal bit of local reporting, is to look at local curricula on immigration versus the immigration experiences the kids are bringing with them. That's fascinating. Joanna, thank you.
Yep.
This was great.